All right, hello, I'm Stephen Schroeder, and presenting with me today is Sylvia Haas.
Hello.
Welcome to our talk about new courseware tools. Sylvia works on the deployed products and services team, and she was one of the camp directors at the 2020 Wolfram Summer Camp. I am in document and media systems, and I was also a mentor at this year's Wolfram Summer Camp. So far at Wolfram, my main projects have been the computational essay template and form notebooks, which are both coming to Wolfram language in 12.2. What brings Sylvia and I together for this talk is that our projects both have the goal of bringing more tools to educators using Wolfram language. All right. So today, I will be talking about Form Notebook. I'll go over the basics about what it is, and then I'll kind of go over the main parts of it and a quick live demo and some quick blurbs about what is going to go on with Form Notebook in the future. And then Sylvia will talk about question framework. So Form Notebook. A Form Notebook has three main components. The first is a special authoring environment, which is then built into the second component, which is a user-facing Form Notebook. And the third component is an association of the user's responses to the form. Might sound a little confusing right now, but it'll all make sense in a minute. So an author can choose how they want the user's responses to be recorded, and responses to a form can be automatically sent to the author's email, stored in a data bin, or kept in a cloud object. Typical uses for Form Notebook include creating quizzes, surveys, polls, lectures, but there are a million ways that Form Notebooks can be used. For example, in addition to what I just mentioned, Form Notebooks can be used to gather metadata or configuration details that feed into another program, or for data logging, storing to cloud objects, data bins, etc. So now that you know the basic idea of what a Form Notebook is and does, I'll go a bit into detail into each of the three components that I mentioned earlier: the authoring notebook, the user form notebook, and the response association. Okay, so the authoring notebook is where the form is created. As an author of a form, this is where all of the magic happens. Within the authoring notebook, you can insert form elements or editable notebook areas. So for example, this right here is a form element. And form elements and editable notebook areas have an author-defined key that identifies the response in the response association. So for example, the key for this form element is name. And for this one, it's question 1. And you can also, in the authoring notebook, choose what to do with recorded responses using the settings menu. Again, all of this I'll be showing live in a couple minutes. So the second component is the user notebook. So after the author clicks generate, it'll create this user notebook where all of the form elements are built into interactive forms. So for example, this first form element where the label is please enter your name, and then it's looking for a string, it'll build into the form object right here where it prompts you. And a user can go through any of this, answer all of it, and then once they click submit, whatever the author defined in the settings of the authoring notebook, that will happen when the user clicks submit. So whatever the author wants to do with all of the responses, submit will actually do that thing. So all of those form elements and editable notebook areas are scraped, which creates an association where the keys are the author-defined keys that I mentioned before, and the values are the labels and users' responses. Like I said, based on what the author defined, the association is sent to their email, data bin, whatever. And here's an example association from the sample that I had in the last 2 slides. So for example, the key here is name, and then it has the label and what was provided as an answer. Just an extra detail is that all contents within an editable notebook area are scraped and included in the response association. So I will do now a live demo. So here is an example notebook, which is very similar to what you will be seeing. The final version in 12.2 has a few more features that will make authoring easier, but all of the main components are here. So again, you can see each of the form elements. And then here you have the editable notebook area that I was talking about. So anything that is put in between these brackets will be scraped, and all of the cell contents will be included in that response association. So I will add another form element here. So maybe we want to ask, rate your overall understanding of image processing using Wolfram language. And I'll add a slider. So here I'll use the dropdown for the insert bar and add a slider. And I'll change the key to question 4. And the label I'll make rate and any number between 1 and 100. And so you can click this button to see what it'll look like in the user's notebook. And you can go back and forth. And that all looks good to me. I think I like how I've made my quiz. Here's a quick example of what an annotation will look like. It won't be built into the user's notebook. Now, before I go into the user notebook, I'll just take a look at the settings. So I've adjusted the background color of the user notebook and what I want the docked cell text to say. And you can also customize in this little dialog what you want to do with that association, the scraped association. So the default is create dialog, but there's a bunch of other options that we have in a mini library here. So you can submit it to a data bin, send an email, copy it to your clipboard. For today's demo, I'll just leave it on create document.
Stephen, sorry to
Yep.
interrupt.
Sure.
Could you increase your magnification and maximize your windows that you're using? Getting some requests in chat.
Sure. Yeah, I'll increase this and I'll click generate. And then I'll also increase this. So here we have the user notebook, and I'll put in my name. And you can see how the docked cell is adjusted with the colors based on what I specified. And maybe I'll put some responses here and rate my understanding here. So now, as a user, I would click submit, and then whatever the author had defined will happen. Like I said, I just had it set to create document. So it's going to create a document with that scraped association in it. So let's go for it. And make this nice and big. So here's the association. So the name, and then it has the label for the form object and my response. And here's that response, that response. And for the editable notebook area, you can see that we get a cell expression back. It's not super pretty, but that is the complete cell expression of these 2 images right here. And then at the end, you can see what I rated my understanding, which was 46 out of 100. Okay, if there are any questions, I can go back to this demo at the end. But for now, I will conclude my part by saying that as this project goes on, there's going to be more author tools and submission options. And in the future, after 12.2, there will be a Q&A form notebook which has dedicated question types and uses the new assessment function and question object frameworks. And it has DIY courseware creation with special question interfaces. And so to talk about some of that stuff, I will hand this screen share over to Sylvia.
All right. Hi, so I'm Sylvia, and Stephen mentioned before, but I work on the deployed products and services team, and I started this spring, and I've been focusing on the courseware tools, but mostly the question framework, which is what we're going to talk about today. And just so to give you an idea of like how it fits in with what Stephen's been talking about, right? So he was just talking about more of the front end, and now we're going to talk about the back end. So it won't be as pretty, but it does some cool stuff. So the question framework is sort of going to fit in with these Q&A form notebooks. So when you get those response associations, it will grade them. So let's start talking about the pieces in question framework. So first up is the assessment function, and that's the grading tool. So it's going to be an automated grader for quiz, test, lecture questions. And it has a bunch of cool options. You can have like element-wise assessment, which allows for things like partial credit. You can include explanations for why an answer is correct or not. You can have tolerances and distance functions. So you don't have to have just one right answer. You can allow for some variance in that. For example, if you had a question asking for a specific location, if a student put in an answer that was within 50 miles, you could count it as correct. But there are a bunch of different functions and options that allow you to customize assessment function to do all sorts of cool things. Another aspect of it is that it has built-in comparison methods. So for things like tolerance or distance, some of these things like vectors, date objects, city locations are going to have that just built into it already, which is the cool part of Wolfram language, is that it has so many of these things built into it. So the second part that I want to talk about is assessment result object. So assessment function and assessment result object are both planned to be in 12.2. And if assessment function is the grader, assessment result object is the grade. So when a student provides an answer and you run it through the assessment function, you get back this association full of interesting information for teachers and students. It's going to have the grade they got, like their score. It's going to have whether they were right or not, what the target answer was. If there was an explanation provided, that'll be in there. And we'll see examples of these in just a second. And a third thing I wanted to touch on that's not in 12.2, but sort of bundles them all together is question object, which is going to tie together a prompt or an actual question with an assessment function. So you don't just have a grader floating around, not tied to anything. And that will fit in nicely with these Q&A form notebooks. So let's jump into a demo here. I'm going to start with a question from one of Stephen's notebooks. It was just the first question on his slides, and it was a multiple choice question. So the assessment function for this might look something like this. It's going to have our three options. One of them is going to be true, the other two are false. And if we run it, it will give us a cute little assessment function. So if we run it with our answer here, I want to be right first. So if we run it through there, it will give us a correct answer. We get our little check mark that we know we're right. And let's test it with the wrong one. But these have all sorts of other information in them. So if we want to know what our score was, we can see that we got 1. Right, if we test it here, we got 0 points. And you can easily create one. So if I want to say that if I'm wrong, I get negative points, and if I'm right, I get positive score. If we run it now, I get 3 points or negative 1 points. So that's just sort of like multiple choice, one right answer example. So another example here for one with tolerance. If our question is to write out an approximation of pi, I'm not a teacher, but I'm also not very picky. So if they get it within 0.01 of the right answer, I'll accept it. I'm a nice teacher. So you can see that it's accepting numbers. So if I'm a super student and I give it a great number, it loves it. If I give one that's not so great, it's going to say that I'm wrong. And right, you can use all sorts of tolerances. You can use a distance and play around with those as well. All right, so one more option or example of the many options of assessment function are you can use patterns or entities. So, right, you don't want to have to write out all of the different options. You can just use the built-in patterns and entities that are already in Wolfram language. So you can ask a student to provide an even number, for example. If we run this, we give them the answer 2, we love it. But if we say 3, it's angry. And similarly, we can do it for something like name a European country using the entities. And then if we give it Germany, it works. So to build off of that a little bit, I just wanted to show you the partial credit and element-wise assessment. So instead of just listing one country, you can have them list multiple countries. So and grade each of those independently. So let's run this. And if we run our example here, it gives us this, which we know we're right, but I think it's more interesting if we actually look at what's inside of this. Let's just look at everything. Right, we can see that our score is 2, where its default is 1 point per correct answer, and we got 2. Overall, we were correct. This was what the student provided. There was no explanations from the teacher, but we also get a breakdown of all of the different scores and whether they were correct per answer. So if we put in one that is incorrect, you can see that our last option was false, which will give us an overall false because we have to be correct for the whole thing by default. But for fun, let's throw in another option here. So if we type in answer correct, a very short option, and then we can say that if any of them are true, we will accept them. Okay. So if we run that, it should give us this answer correct should turn from false to true. Like magic. Okay, so right, you can customize all sorts of things. There are a bunch of options. But moving forward, right, there are quite a few comparison methods already in there, but there are so many more that could be added to allow for this like built-in concept of tolerance and so more comparison methods. as well as allowing for remote assessment, right, so that the answers aren't baked into the notebook. You would send them to the cloud, which would be hopefully helpful for teachers to grade things. Their students can just submit them to the cloud to get graded and get their grades back that way. But also working with Stephen more to integrate the question objects and the form notebooks. So we're going to move on to Q&A now, if you guys have questions. So that wraps up the talking part. But also with us, you've heard him speaking with your comments, is Arben from Education Partnerships to help answer any questions that you guys have. So send us questions in chat. We would love to hear your thoughts, comments. This stuff is all in development, so we want to hear from you.
So we have a comment from Seth Chandler asking kind of about textual responses and what sort of powers we might have for grading those. So would you like to take that, Sylvia? I have some feelings, but you're the developer.
So yes, there's not a lot of things. So like spelling, I feel like there can be all sorts of things that could be built in for that. We don't have anything, I don't think, right now, but right, like if they capitalize random letters or spell things weird, or yeah, giving sort of like a distance for spelling, I think is definitely possible.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, at the very least, you could do some kind of like string pattern matching that looks for the word in a response. But I think for a lot of like more complicated questions, you're just going to need to take a look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, there are a lot of things that you could do with kind of analyzing textual responses, like you're asking about a specific court case. So you could see, you know, does this person's response contain certain words or phrases that should be there? Or, you know, does it have some specific length that you think it really ought to have if it's going to, you know, be a sufficient answer? You can ask all sorts of questions about that text. But those sorts of things, you would have to kind of generate those tests for the text yourself, currently, at least.
Yeah.
We have another question from Kelvin asking about, will we have any examples where the interpreter is for an expression? So the question would grade computations created by a student. And then we could see and grade whether they wrote the computation correctly.
Yeah, definitely. There's things in the works right now to just like grade like just any Wolfram code. So like you can have, right, you can write code in so many different ways, but having it all have the same, is it doing what you actually want it to do? And
There's a whole
like code comparisons for that.
Yeah, there's a whole branch of people working on code equivalents that will hopefully be eventually a part of the stuff that is going on here.
I think something that's exciting on, you know, sort of related to expressions, a little more specific from educators I've spoken to and from my time teaching, is because of the generality of Wolfram language, you could ask students, you know, give a symbolic answer in terms of pi. You could ask them, give a numeric answer to such and such precision, like Sylvia showed off. You could say, give the answer as a fraction, or, you know, give the nearest, give the nearest fraction within some tolerance. There's kind of a lot of freedom in the specifics you can ask for that you usually don't get from current like computational grading systems, which I think is really useful in terms of, mathematics and physics in particular. I'm biased because that's where my background is, but students and teachers both really don't like these grading systems online where you go in and the student has to, type in 3.14159 for pi or however many digits they want. And then they have to type it in a specific way with a specific number of decimals to get the right numeric answer. So we can totally avoid all of that and do things in a much more elegant way. Okay, some more questions coming in from Pathable. Michael, don't mind my cat who has just woken up and is now walking around meowing because I'm not petting her. She was asleep when the meeting started. I'm so sorry, Caden. So Michael in Pathable asks, is there a way to dumb down Mathematica? So if they were to ask a student, what is sine of pi over 6? Can we make sure that they type in 1/2 or 0.5 and not sine pi over 6 and have that evaluate to, evaluate to the actual value? If that's
yeah, I think the goal of the comparison types is that you can sort of narrow down what exactly you're looking for.
The full documentation for assessment function is quite impressive. Sylvia only showed a very small portion of what it can really do, so looking forward to seeing that.
There are many options and functions, and you can customize it as much as you want.
Let's see.
So there's another question by Phil. I think after reading it, the impression I get is that he's looking for some kind of like, if a student answers a certain way, is it possible to have the rest of the assessment or quiz or whatever kind of adjust to the way that the student answered the first question? I think the answer to that currently is no, but I think that is an interesting idea and I'm happy to take a note of it. I think it seems like it could be nice. I know in the Q&A form notebook, one feature that is planned to be included is that if you can have hints included in questions, and you can also have feedback. So say you answer incorrectly to a question, you can set it to give some kind of feedback saying, oh, that's not the right answer. Maybe think about this. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
And I see that David has asked if we would be able to recognize and compare graphs and plots. And I have a suspicion, but I will leave that to you two.
I feel like that will fall under like the code equivalence for right now. So if they type in the code for it, then yes.
And that can be, I guess this is going to be worked into the code options, but even off the top of my head, I can think of ways to be like, did they type plot such and such from this initial value to this final value? And then, if they put in options, you could even ignore the options as long as they typed in the right code.
Yeah.
Am I wrong to say that there's also direct graphics comparison as long as they have typed in the same code? I think that's less useful though.
Yeah.
I think we can be around for a couple more minutes. We can go over time a little bit. So if you guys have any more questions, we can be around. Maybe we can give it a couple more minutes just to see if there are any further questions. Phil asks, can I generate questions from templates with different parameter values for each question instance? I see. So, right. So randomizing a test, for example. This is a feature that I hope that we include eventually. I think the way that Form Notebook is going to be included in 12.2, that's not going to be there, but hopefully that will be a feature that is eventually included, and hopefully will just be included base with the Q&A Form Notebook as soon as it comes out.
I feel like the next talks are starting, so
Yeah.
we should let people go.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much for coming and for all your great questions.
Yes, thank you all. Have a good afternoon.